At 5:52 that morning, my son texted me. Change of plans. Mom and Richard are taking my flight instead. There'll be another wedding. I read it twice. Set my coffee down on the porch railing I'd rebuilt with my own two hands the summer he turned 12. Then I typed back 3 words. Have a great time. And I called my brother, who happens to be a real estate attorney. I know how that sounds. Detached. Maybe you're thinking a father should fight for his place at his own son's wedding, should call and demand an explanation, should show up at that church in Savannah no matter what anybody said. I didn't have that fight left in me. 31 years teaches you something nobody tells you going in, that the losing happens quietly, long before anybody sends the text that makes it official. My name is Walter Greaves. I'm 62 years old. I spent 3 decades building custom cabinetry and furniture out of a workshop behind my house in a small town outside Knoxville, Tennessee. And until that Tuesday morning, if you'd asked me, I'd have told you I had a complicated relationship with my ex-wife, but a solid one with my son. Solid enough. The kind you don't inspect too closely, because inspecting it feels like inviting trouble that hasn't arrived yet. The garment bag with my suit was already hanging on the back of my truck's cab, pressed the night before at the dry cleaners on Main Street. Next to it on the passenger seat sat a small wooden box I'd built myself out of walnut, the kind of thing I make when I've got something worth protecting. Inside was a first edition of Robert Frost's poems that had belonged to my own father, wrapped in tissue paper, meant to be my wedding gift to my son and his fiancée. I'd been planning to hand it to him quietly before the ceremony and tell him what it meant, the way my father never got the chance to tell me anything before he passed. This wasn't just a wedding I was attending. It was supposed to be the day I finally stood in the same room as my son, as something other than the man who used to live in this family. Denise, my ex-wife, and I split 9 years ago, and Richard came into the picture not long after. I'd spent every one of those 9 years showing up anyway. Every graduation, every Christmas, every hospital visit, when my son broke his collarbone falling off a roof he had no business being on. I'd driven 4 hours each way, more times than I could count, because distance was never going to be the reason I missed something that mattered. Richard had never been part of the wedding planning committee until about 6 weeks before the date. The excuse was logistics. Richard knew a photographer. Richard had a connection at the venue. Richard could help cover the difference when the caterer's price came in higher than expected. Then somewhere along the way, Denise and my son started talking about how Richard had never gotten to walk a daughter or son down an aisle of his own, how meaningful it would be for him to have a real role in this one, how this could be the moment that made him feel like part of the family instead of an outsider looking in. I figured at worst they'd seat him up front with the rest of the family, and I'd walk in behind him, same as always. I actually pictured Richard standing there in his rented tux, nodding at me politely from a few rows back. That text told me otherwise. I didn't throw the phone into the yard, though I thought about it. I didn't put my fist through anything. Even though there's not a wall in that house I couldn't fix myself in under an hour. I just stood on my porch and looked at that garment bag hanging in my truck. And I thought about something that had never sat quite so plainly in my mind before. For 31 years, I was the man they called when the transmission needed replacing, when tuition came up short, when somebody needed picking up from a party at 2 in the morning with no questions asked. But the second a version of fatherhood with better optics came along, I became a man who could be swapped out of his own son's wedding photos. Denise texted again. Please don't make a scene about this. It's Cole's day, not yours. I read that line 3 or 4 times, standing there in the cold. And here's what really got under my skin. Cole hadn't waited his whole life for a moment with Richard walking him anywhere. He'd had me his whole life. But in the story they'd apparently decided to tell themselves, 31 years of actually being there didn't weigh as much as 6 weeks of Richard offering to write a check. I called my brother, Samuel. He's a real estate attorney 2 towns over, and he's fielded plenty of calls from me over the years, disputes with suppliers, a lien on a client's property, the occasional argument about zoning for the workshop. He'd never heard me ask for what I asked him that morning. I didn't tell him I wanted to punish anybody. That's never been who I am. I told him, I want to know exactly what's mine, what's shared, and how I walk away from every financial thread connecting me to that family without breaking a single law. Samuel told me to sleep on it, not to act while I was still raw. I told him I'd had 9 years since the divorce, and 31 years total to arrive at this decision, and there was nothing sudden about it. Saying it out loud surprised even me, because it was true. I'd been quietly circling the idea of selling the house. Denise and I used to share custody arrangements around the one I'd bought outright in the settlement and had been renting to a young family for the last several years. I'd had it appraised 8 months earlier. I knew, because I'd checked with Samuel long before any of this, that the property was entirely mine, clean title, no entanglements. I'd also been the one quietly funding a trust for Cole's education. And, later, his first house down payment money Denise didn't know the full size of, because I'd never seen the need to announce it. I opened the account where I'd been covering half the wedding costs as my gift to Cole, on top of the honeymoon I'd already paid for in full as a surprise 10 days in Portugal. Flights, a rental car, a whole coastal itinerary I'd built with more care than I'd built anything in my workshop that year. I couldn't undo everything, but I could stop what hadn't cleared yet. I canceled the remaining balance on the venue's catering upgrade. I pulled my card off the honeymoon booking. I withdrew as the backup contact on the wedding planner's contract. I hit the first button, and my phone lit up almost instantly, with Denise's name filling the screen. I turned it face down on my workbench and didn't touch it again that day. By the time the wedding party gathered for rehearsal dinner that evening, they still believed they'd simply swapped one man walking in for another standing beside him. They had no idea they just lost the man quietly underwriting half the day. I couldn't touch everything. Cole and his fiancée, Ava, had booked their own venue deposit long before Richard entered the conversation, so that part sat outside my reach, and I never once considered touching it. That wasn't Cole's fault. Whatever his mother had decided to do with the seating chart. But the honeymoon, the catering upgrade, the videographer's second package, all of that had gone through my card, my accounts, balances still sitting open. I canceled what could be canceled and let the rest simply lapse unpaid. The travel insurance clawed back a portion, not close to everything. $10,000 doesn't disappear painlessly for anybody, retired cabinet maker or not. But there was something almost clarifying about watching those numbers fall away. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was willing to pay actual money for the privilege of no longer footing a bill for my own diminishment. Denise called from the rehearsal dinner. Once, then 4 more times. The text started soft. "Walter, please, let's just talk before this gets out of hand." Then they turned sharp fast. "Walter, the videographer says the deposit bounced." This is humiliating in front of Richard's whole family. Humiliating. That was the word she reached for. Not confused, not concerned. Humiliating. As if I'd worn the wrong color tie to a formal dinner. Cole's text came 20 minutes later. "You don't have to punish everyone because you're hurt." I read that one twice. Sitting alone at my kitchen table in a house that felt bigger than I'd ever noticed before. Not once did he ask if I was actually okay. Not once did he ask why a father might be hurt in the first place. Only that my hurt was inconveniencing people who had somewhere nicer to be that week. I answered him only once. "If Richard's walking you into that ceremony, let Richard cover what walking beside you costs." I didn't hear back after that. Richard ended up scrambling to cover part of the catering shortfall himself, grudgingly, from what my brother heard secondhand through the venue coordinator. The wedding went forward. For a couple of days, from what little I gathered, everyone told themselves they'd weathered my little tantrum and life would go back to normal once the honeymoon started. I want to tell you about 3 moments, because listing 31 years of showing up would take all night, and 3 is enough to understand the shape of it. The first, Cole was 8, running a fever that spiked past 104 on a Tennessee summer night thick enough to choke on. Denise was 2 hours away visiting her sister. I called Richard's number. This was back when Richard occasionally still answered a call from our shared world and got nothing. So I sat on the edge of Cole's bed with a bowl of ice water and washcloths until nearly 3 in the morning, and then I drove him to the emergency room myself, running 2 red lights I still don't feel bad about. When the fever finally broke and he came out of that fog enough to focus on my face, he grabbed my finger with his whole small hand and said, "Don't go, Dad." First time in months he'd called me that instead of just, "Hey." The second, his college graduation. I'd quietly covered the difference when his financial aid fell through his junior year. Never made a thing of it, just paid it and let him think the scholarship had simply come through. Richard showed up 20 minutes late in an expensive watch and somehow ended up in the center of every photograph. When the photographer called out, "Let's get one with the parents," Cole pulled his mother and Richard in close around him. I stood off to the side, holding the extra folding chairs like hired help. The third, last Father's Day, Cole posted a long, heartfelt message online, thanking Richard for stepping up, for being there when it counted, for showing him what a real man looks like. On my kitchen counter that same week, he'd left a card. It read, "Walter, thanks for always being reliable. Not Dad, just a name and a compliment you'd give a good mechanic." I sat with that card a long time before I ever mentioned it to Samuel. I went into Samuel's office 3 weeks before the wedding and told him what I wanted. Prepare the paperwork to formally dissolve the Education Trust's remaining discretionary clause. Confirm the rental property's title was as clean as I remembered. Move forward on listing it. I'd been circling this for the better part of a year. Samuel leaned back in his chair and asked me plainly, "Do you want to give Cole a chance to understand what's happening before we set any of this in motion?" "He made his choice about where I stand in this family," I said. He made it in a text message on a Tuesday morning. Samuel slid a folder across his desk. "There's one thing you need to sit with before you sign anything. This isn't a statement to anybody. This is your actual life changing." I picked up the pen. My hand held steady, mostly, except for a small tremor at the end of my signature that I'd been noticing for months and hadn't told anybody about yet. Samuel noticed it too. His eyes flicked up, then back down, and he didn't say a word about it, which I appreciated more than he probably realized. 4 months before any of this, I'd sat in a cardiologist's office in Knoxville, under lighting that made everybody look a little bit dead already, next to a poster of a heart with too many labeled arrows. The doctor had a calm, direct way of talking that I respected, even as I hated every word of it. "It's early-stage heart failure," he said. "Manageable if you make changes now, but you need to start planning for what your capacity looks like in 5 years, not just this year." I'd noticed the signs myself before he said anything, the tiredness that coffee couldn't touch anymore, the shortness of breath climbing the same porch steps I'd built with my own hands, a swelling in my ankles I'd been blaming on standing too long in the workshop. I hadn't told Denise, obviously, we'd been divorced 9 years, but I hadn't told Cole either. Not because I didn't trust him, because I wanted to understand exactly what I was facing before I put that weight on him. I wanted the wedding to be the moment I told him actually sat him down after the ceremony, when the day wasn't about me, and explained that his father's heart was starting to fail, and that there were things we needed to talk through, decisions I needed his help thinking about. I'd packed the walnut box with the book of poems, and tucked in beside it, a folded letter I'd written him explaining all of it, meant to be read quietly, not performed. That text about Richard walking him down the aisle cracked something open in me. And what spilled out was this: they still saw me as the man who showed up for the family, not a man who might, sooner than any of us wanted, need the family to show up for him. A few weeks before the wedding, Cole had noticed me catching my breath at the top of his apartment stairs and asked, "You doing okay, old man? Maybe slow down on the stairs." He never asked why. He asked about the pace, about whether I needed to hurry less, never about whether something underneath the tiredness needed looking at. Here's the moment that really turned things for me. The night before the wedding, Denise accidentally left a voicemail running on my phone while talking to Richard. Must have hit call back instead of hanging up, because it recorded nearly 2 full minutes of their conversation and landed in my inbox before midnight. Her voice came through easy, almost fond. "He'll sulk for a week and then he'll come around. Walter always does. He likes being needed. Richard asked what happened if I didn't come around this time." She laughed, quiet and certain. "He won't cut Cole off completely. He spent 31 years building his whole identity around taking care of that boy." That line did more damage than any insult could have, because she wasn't wrong about who I used to be. She understood me completely. She just only ever understood the parts of me that were useful to her. I went back to Samuel's office the next morning, hours before the ceremony, and signed everything. Trust modification, rental listing authorization, updated beneficiary designations on 2 accounts Cole didn't know existed, a plan to redirect a portion of what remained into a scholarship fund at the trade school where I used to guest teach woodworking on Saturdays. My hand shook clean through the last signature, and this time I didn't bother hiding it. Samuel asked, "Does Cole know about your heart?" "No." "Are you going to tell him?" I looked down at a signature that wasn't as steady as it used to be. "I was going to tell my son today. I'm no longer sure today's the right day for it, or that I even still have the kind of relationship where that news lands the way it should." He told me the rental property sale would take about 3 weeks to close properly, not overnight like I'd hoped. "That's fine," I said. "They'll be gone 12 days on that honeymoon I already paid for most of. The rest can move through your office while I'm nowhere near the middle of it." The wedding wasn't long enough to erase 31 years of fatherhood. It wasn't long enough to undo the version of myself that had spent 3 decades making sure everybody else got taken care of first. But it was long enough to stop protecting the people who'd made it clear, in one text on a Tuesday morning, that protecting them had never once been something they thought to return. Truth is, I'd been circling the idea of finally letting go of that rental property for over a year before any of this happened. Cole was grown, married now, building his own life 2 states away in Charlotte. The upkeep on a rental 4 hours from my house made less and less sense the older I got, and my cardiologist's warnings about long drives and stress had been sitting in the back of my mind for months. I'd already gotten a preliminary appraisal, already talked with a local investor who'd shown interest the year before, already had the title pulled and reviewed, already had my paperwork organized in a fireproof box in my workshop, because Samuel likes things organized, and frankly, so do I. That text didn't create a plan. It just ended my hesitation about using one I already had. I accepted an offer 9% under market value in exchange for a clean, fast close with no repairs required, no months of strangers walking through a property while the tenants I liked packed up around them. 19 days, start to finish. 19 days meant this could all be settled quietly before Cole and Ava even landed back from Portugal. Samuel's office handled every notification by the book certified mail, digital copies, a clear timeline laid out for anyone with a stake in the money. Nothing sneaky about any of it. Cole saw the subject line of that first email from Samuel's office while he was still in the airport lounge waiting to board for the honeymoon. He told me later he figured it was just me trying to guilt him into calling before he left the country. He never opened it. He texted instead, "We'll deal with whatever this is when we're back. Don't do anything you'll regret." I didn't answer that one either. I want to be clear about something regarding the trust in the rental income. Cole had been quietly counting on as a cushion for his and Ava's first house down payment, still a year or two off. I didn't touch a dollar that wasn't legally mine to redirect. Samuel confirmed every signature, every clause, every dollar figure through proper legal channels. I didn't hide anything, didn't backdate anything, didn't touch a single account that had already vested in Cole's name outright. What I did was stop feeding new money into a fund built on the assumption that I'd always be there to top it off, no matter how I was treated, and I redirected the portion, still legally under my discretion, about $60,000 toward the scholarship fund instead. Cole would still get what had already vested. He just wouldn't get what I hadn't given yet. There was one moment that got me, packing up my own house that same week. Unrelated to any of it. Just an old man doing some long overdue cleaning while his son was overseas. I found a box of Cole's report cards, drawings, a Father's Day card from when he was 6 that said, in shaky crayon letters, "My dad can fix anything." I sat on the floor of my workshop holding that card a long time. I didn't take a picture of it. Some things don't need to be posted anywhere to still be real. They just live where you leave them. My neighbor Grady came by while I was hauling boxes to my truck. Known him almost 20 years. "Everything all right, Walter?" he asked, nodding at the boxes. "Working through some things," I told him. He asked if Denise or Cole knew what was happening with the property. "My attorney's office does." "Whether Cole knows depends on whether he opens his email," I said. He asked where I figured I'd land once the dust settled. "Somewhere quieter, with fewer stairs," I told him. And I meant it mostly as a joke, though it wasn't really a joke at all. I found a small, single-story place near a lake outside Chattanooga, close enough to a good cardiology practice that appointments wouldn't eat my whole week, with a detached garage big enough for my tools, and an old John boat I'd been meaning to fix up for a decade. I changed my main phone number and kept one email open strictly for Samuel and for the scholarship committee. The last thing I did before handing the rental keys over to the new owner was leave a manila envelope on the kitchen counter for the tenants who were transitioning out. Not a stunt, not a parting shot. Inside was contact information, a partial refund of their last month's rent I didn't legally owe them, but felt right giving anyway, and a short note wishing them well. I locked the door one final time and shook the new owner's hand, a young couple expecting their first child. I told them to take care of the place, and I meant that too. While I was quietly wrapping up loose ends in Tennessee, Cole, Ava, and the wedding party were still overseas. And for a few days, from what little Grady mentioned before catching himself and apologizing for prying, everything looked exactly like what Cole had said he wanted: cobblestone streets, a beautiful dinner overlooking the Atlantic, a photo of Cole and Richard captioned, grateful for the men who raised me. I didn't go looking for any of it. Grady sent me one photo before catching himself. Don't send me any more, was all I said, and he didn't. But cracks show up fast once the person quietly holding the finances together steps back. And Richard, as it turned out, had never actually held anything together in that family beyond showing up for the parts that photographed well. He'd covered the catering shortfall with visible resentment, from what the venue coordinator mentioned to Samuel weeks later. On the honeymoon, he balked at the upgraded excursions Cole and Ava had assumed were already paid for. He told Ava she ought to cover her own spa day. He got irritated when Cole brought up, gently, what their finances might look like once the wedding bills actually came due. One evening at dinner in Lisbon, Ava brought up a memory from when Cole broke his collarbone falling off that roof years back. Richard smiled and said, I remember driving you to that hospital. Which hospital was it? Cole asked. Richard didn't know. Cole did. He'd been there the whole night, in the waiting room, because I was the one who'd actually taken him. Denise opened the email from Samuel's office on day 9 of the trip. She tried calling me. The number didn't connect. She called Samuel instead, and he told her, calm and even, all communication regarding this matter should go through your own attorney. She hung up rattled, but tried to keep it from Cole so it wouldn't ruin what was left of the honeymoon. Richard told her not to worry. He's bluffing, he said. Men like Walter need somebody to take care of. He'll come around once he's home alone with nothing to do. That line landed strange on Denise, though she couldn't place why at first. It was almost word for word what she'd said herself in that voicemail, that I'd never actually walk away, that I'd built my whole identity around being needed. Hearing it come out of someone else's mouth, aimed at her, seemed to shift something. For the first time, I think she understood that both of them had been looking at me the exact same way, like a man too soft to ever actually leave. Cole found out about the rental sale by accident, catching sight of a notification on his mother's phone. He sold the property because of the wedding, he said, sharp, angry. Don't blame this on the wedding right now. Denise snapped back. Cole went quiet. It was, I think, the first time the weight of what he'd actually done sat on him directly instead of on me. Richard tried to smooth it over. Your father's trying to control you with money, he told Cole. Cole asked plainly. So what happens to the house Ava and I were saving toward? Richard gave him nothing. We'll figure something out, he said. The kind of answer a man gives when he's never once had to actually figure anything out for somebody else. By the last night of the honeymoon, nobody was posting photos anymore. Richard and Denise had an argument about the final bill loud enough that the restaurant asked them to take it outside. Ava stood on their hotel balcony that night looking out at the water and started to understand that the cushion they'd been quietly counting on might really be gone. They flew back into Charlotte on a Thursday afternoon. Cole picked up his phone the second it had signal and saw 4 missed calls from the property manager who used to handle the rental, a number he only had because I'd once asked him to hold on to it in case of an emergency while I traveled. He called back out of habit more than anything, and that's how he found out the tenants had already moved, the new owners had already closed, and the trust that was supposed to help with his own house had been restructured entirely, weeks before anyone bothered opening an email. Cole called me that night. I let it ring twice, then answered. Dad, what did you do? I made a decision about my own money and my own property, I said. The same kind of decision you made about who stood beside you at your wedding. That's not the same thing. It's exactly the same thing, I told him. You decided who mattered enough to occupy the space closest to you on the most important day of your life. I decided the same thing about where my money goes for whatever time I've got left. There was a long silence. Then, quieter. What do you mean, whatever time you've got left? I told him the truth. Early stage heart failure, manageable, for now, with real changes and real medication and a cardiologist I trusted. I told him I'd been planning to tell him after the ceremony that I'd packed his grandfather's book of poems in a letter meant to explain all of it, and that the walnut box was still sitting in my truck because I never got the chance to hand it over. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, why didn't you just tell me before the wedding? Why didn't you fight for your spot instead of disappearing? Because you didn't ask me to fight for it, I said. You told me it was already decided. There's a difference between a man who won't fight and a man who wasn't invited to. 3 months passed. I used part of the proceeds from the rental sale to fully fund that trade school scholarship, named quietly after my own father. A man who never got much of a fair shot himself. I'd hired plenty of young people over 30 years who had real talent and no runway, and I knew what a chance like that could do for somebody, because I'd needed one once too. They held a small ceremony at the school. I was asked to say a few words about craft, about patience, about building things slowly out of material that actually lasts. Denise read about it somewhere and came, with Cole and Ava beside her. Richard came too, mostly because Ava had asked him to. She wanted to see, she told Cole later, whether he was capable of showing up for something that wasn't easy or convenient or photographed well. After I finished speaking, Cole walked toward me through the small crowd. His voice was low, careful. You had enough to fund a scholarship for strangers, but you let Ava and me find out about our own money secondhand. I let you find out the same way I found out I wasn't walking you down that aisle, I said. Secondhand, and after the decision was already made. He said I'd humiliated him in front of his new wife's family. No, I told him. I stopped absorbing the cost of a decision you made in a text message, quietly, out where everyone could finally see it. Ava stepped closer. Walter, she said, I didn't know about any of this until we landed. I want you to know that. I believed her. I told her so. Cole asked me to come back, not into the marriage arrangement, obviously, but back into their lives the way I'd always been, unconditionally, no boundaries attached. I loved being your father when you were 8 years old and scared in an emergency room, I said. Loving you doesn't require me to keep accepting whatever place you decide to hand me, though. That's when Richard stepped in, like he had any right to. This has gone on long enough. Cole has 2 father figures in his life now. I wasn't interested in relitigating who counted as what. I just asked him plainly, in front of everybody, what hospital Cole had gone to for his collarbone. He didn't know. What Cole had studied his sophomore year before he switched majors. He didn't know that either. Cole watched him fail to answer, standing there in front of the scholarship students in their new work boots, and something in his face changed for good. That was really the moment it settled. Not some dramatic reveal, no scandal, just a plain, quiet fact sitting out in the open where everybody could finally see it. Richard had a title, I had a history. And a title, it turns out, doesn't build anything on its own. Cole asked about my heart again later that week, gently this time, like he actually wanted to know instead of needing something from me. I told him the truth, plainly. Manageable. Treatment underway. Better some days than others. His response came fast. Then let us help. Let me help. Help doesn't rebuild itself in one conversation at a scholarship dinner, I told him. But I didn't close the door completely either. I gave him an address, told him to write when he wanted nothing from me, just to talk. A year has gone by since then. I'm still in that little house near the lake outside Chattanooga. Some mornings my chest reminds me exactly how far I've got left to be careful. Some days the medication leaves me slower than I'd like. I've had to learn the hard way how to actually accept help instead of only ever giving it out. There are evenings the quiet in that house gets loud enough to ache, but it's a different kind of quiet than I expected going in. It doesn't feel like loneliness anymore. It feels more like room to finally breathe. I go to cardiac rehab twice a week now. I mentor a handful of the scholarship kids on Saturdays. Nothing formal, just coffee and honest conversation about work and patience and building things that last. Grady and I still fish most weekends, same as always. I still tinker in the garage on that old John boat, not because it needs fixing so badly, but because my hands like the work. I'm not a healthier man than I was a year ago, and I'm certainly not a richer one. But I stopped being afraid that being loved required me to keep paying for it. Denise sent me a letter a few months back. No demands in it, no request to rewrite the past, just a plain apology. I wrote back and told her I forgave her. I also told her clearly that whatever version of co-parenting we'd been running on autopilot for 9 years was over, and we'd both need to be honest adults about that going forward. Both things were true at once. I've come to believe they usually are. Richard drifted further out of the picture once Ava stopped looking at him like a man who'd earned his seat rather than claimed it. Cole doesn't chase that particular disappointment anymore. He told me once that wanting his mother to be happy was never the mistake. The mistake was assuming a father who showed up every single day for 31 years could be quietly moved to a smaller chair without anybody noticing the difference. Cole writes to me regularly now. The early letters were mostly apology, and I answered those politely, nothing more. Eventually, he stopped writing about what happened and started telling me about his actual life instead of promotion. A house he and Ava were finally able to afford on their own, without anybody's cushion under them, a woodworking class he'd signed up for on Tuesday nights because he wanted to understand what I'd spent my whole life doing with my hands. After several months of that, I agreed to meet him for coffee. He didn't lead with an apology this time. He just said, "Thanks for meeting me, Dad. Thanks for coming without needing me to fix anything," I told him. It wasn't a movie reunion. It was just a small, honest start. Back home that evening, I opened the walnut box I'd built all those months ago. The book of poems was still tucked inside, the tissue paper a little worn at the folds. I didn't throw it away. I never will. Forgiving somebody doesn't mean pretending the love you had for them wasn't real. But I didn't hand it over that day either. It stayed right there in the box, alongside the other things that belong to a life I've already lived through, waiting for the day the giving of it means what it was always supposed to mean. For most of my life, I believed being a father meant staying available no matter how little of myself was left standing by the end of the day. I know better now. Sometimes love means stepping back before resentment turns you into somebody you don't recognize in your own mirror. They thought I disappeared to get even with them. The truth is simpler than that. I stepped back because for the first time in 31 years, I finally understood that my life, whatever's left of it, belongs to me too. If you've ever had to pull back from somebody you love just to hold on to who you actually are, I'd genuinely like to hear what that taught you. Thanks for sitting with me through this one. Take care of yourselves out there, and take care of the people who show up for you before you ever have to ask. Being needed and being loved aren't the same thing, and it takes a lifetime to feel the difference. What Walter learned wasn't to stop giving, but to stop giving without being seen, because real love shows up on ordinary Tuesdays, not just in front of a camera. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for the people you love is show them what your absence actually costs, so they finally notice what your presence was worth all along. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI for entertainment purposes, while hopefully leaving you with a genuine, positive life lesson.